Salawat. We'll inshallah be starting the program with the recitation of Qur'an by Haydar Asaria. Can we welcome him with a loud salawat?
The mic on. I'm praying Surah Yusuf ayah 27 to 30. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wa in kana kamithuhu kudda min duburin fakatabat wa huwa minas sadiqin. فلما رأى قميصه قد من دبر قال إنه من كيدكن إن كيدكن عظيم يوسف أعرض عن هذا واستغفري لذنبك إنك كنت من الخاطئين وكان نسوة في المدينة امرأة العزيز تراود فتها النفس قد سقفها هب إنا لنراها في ضلال مبين صدق الله العظيم.
Today we're privileged to be joined by Ali Khimji, who is going to be talking to us about poverty in the UK. Can we welcome him with a loud salawat? Ali Khimji is the director of Al-Mizan Charitable Trust. He has worked in a number of roles across the charity sector, including managing central government funding program and advising charities on fundraising. He is also the operations manager at Ansar Youth Project. Salawat.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you to Mahfil for allowing me to speak tonight about poverty in the UK. So my name is Ali Khimji. I'm the director of Al-Mizan Charitable Trust. Al-Mizan Charitable Trust was set up about 11 years ago to support families living in poverty across the UK. The main thing we do is give out small grants up to about £500 towards the costs of education, employment, household items, disability costs, and subsistence costs, so like food vouchers, clothing vouchers, energy bills. Previously, we've given out Ramadan food parcels. Is that better? Previously, we've also given out Ramadan food parcels, winter warmer packs, back-to-school backpacks, and mother and baby kits. So I'm here today to talk about poverty in the UK. So we're going to discuss things like what is it, how bad it actually is, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, the welfare state and its role in tackling poverty, how we actually talk about poverty in the UK and framing the conversation, and also some potential solutions. So to really discuss an issue, you first have to be able to understand it and define it properly. So we're going to start with some audience participation. So who can remember what the median is from secondary school maths? Yeah. Yeah, perfect. So the answer was that if you put them in ascending or descending order, the middle number will give you the median. So could we have the next slide, please? So as you can see there, you've got 5 numbers. When you put them in ascending order, the number 4 is the median number. If we go to the next slide, please. So the UK government and various statutory bodies have a definition that they use to define poverty within this country. So first, there's a relative definition. So people in relative low income. So what they do is they look at the median income, and 60% of that is the poverty line in this country. So for example, if the median was £100 a week, the poverty line would be £60 per week, exactly. There's also an absolute low income line, so that's where they look at, they have a base year, so that takes into account inflation, but relative low income is the one that we are more interested in. If we go to the next slide, please. So as you can see there, that's the actual figures that tell you what the poverty line in this country are. They use 2 calculations, so before housing costs and after housing costs, because generally poorer families spend a larger proportion of their income on housing. So because of that disproportionate impact, you have those 2 calculations. So in the year 2019-20, the median income was about £28,500 per year. So 60% of that is about £17,000 per year. So if you have an income below that, you're considered to be in poverty within this country. Could we go to the next slide, please? So this is another definition of poverty that's used, which is called the Web of Poverty. It's developed by an organisation called the Church Urban Fund. So they're the Church of England social action charity. And this is quite an interesting definition because it shows that you can be impoverished in quite a few different ways. So there's 3 main categories on the web. So you've got the poverty of resources, so that's all about your income and how many assets you have and things like that. You've got the poverty of relationships, so that's about your community and like what networks you have and how people can help you around you. And then you've also got the poverty of identity, so that's to do with your self-esteem and confidence and how you can sort of your sort of well-being, your personal well-being. And it's good because it shows how all of these issues are quite interlinked and you can also get trapped within the web. And it shows how poverty can be like quite complex and multidimensional. So for example, you might be rich in sort of assets and income, but if you don't have like a high self-esteem or you don't have a sense of community around you, then you are impoverished. So it's quite a good leveler in a sense, in that we can all be impoverished in a way. Although, because it's called a web of poverty, it kind of triggers my arachnophobia. So, can we go to the next slide, please? And then again, this is another simple definition of poverty in the UK. So how easily can you get £100 in cash? For a lot of us, we could just go to the cash machine and just withdraw £100 quite easily. If it's quite close to payday and you're running short of funds, you might be able to ask friends or family to borrow £100 in cash so you can get it again. But actually, for people living in poverty in this country, they will actually find it quite challenging to get £100 in cash. Could we go to the next slide, please? So one of the things that at Al-Mizan and generally when you're working and sort of talking about poverty in the UK is it actually really that bad? Growing up, we've always associated poverty with the developing world or the global south. And it can be a valid question because we sort of have to say, well, yeah, people in those countries have very little as well. They often have like no shelter, no food, and sort of no basic necessities. So we have to sort of think about, well, yeah, how do we sort of measure poverty in this country? How do we define it? How do we talk about it relative to that as well? If we go to the next slide, please. So if we think back to that definition of how easily can you get £100 in cash, This survey that I think Aviva did a couple of years ago found that 44% of the UK population have savings of less than £100. So that's actually quite a staggering figure. But like for a lot of people, whatever they earn is just going back out as living costs because of high living costs in this country. And also what's interesting that survey found is that 45% of those with no savings had an income above £30,000. So thinking back again to that definition of the poverty line based on income, for some of those people that were earning like nearly double the poverty line, they still have no savings, so they still are in a very precarious financial position. So again, we just sort of have to look at other things beyond income. Could we go to the next slide, please? So I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with food banks in this country. So SIFRA North West London, that SICM has been part of for a couple of years now. So generally, if you can't afford food, you can go to a food bank to get a food parcel to feed your family. And this bar chart just shows just how, like, I don't really want to use the word popular, but like how prominent food banks have become in this country, that there's more food banks than branches of Greggs. And I think if you add up the branches of McDonald's, KFC and Pret, you still have less than the number of food banks in this country. So yeah, I think from what I remember, I think like around 2006, 2007, there was only about 10 food banks in this country. And then from 2010, when austerity started kicking in, that's when food banks had just exploded in this country. Could we go to the next slide, please? So we've talked about defining poverty and understanding poverty based on income and savings, but also poverty can be linked to your expenditure as well. So there's this quite weird phenomenon called the poverty premium, where if you're poor, your things that you have to pay for are more expensive. So things like energy, credit, and insurance. Because, for example, like insurance, if you're living in a low-income neighborhood, crime might be high, so your insurance will be higher. But then your income's not that high, so you have to fork out that extra cost from somewhere. Yeah, it's quite nicely summed up by that tagline, paying more to be poor. And I think so if you have to pay an extra £478 a year for essentials. If you think about often at the other end of the spectrum, if you're quite wealthy and comfortable, often you go to like a lot of events where they give you free stuff and free lunch. So like life is a bit cheaper when you're more rich. Could we go to the next slide, please? So based on the initial government definition that we looked at before, the 60% of the median, so before housing costs, we have 11.7 million people in this country, so about 18% of the population in relative poverty. And then after housing costs, 22% of the population are absolute poverty. So just thinking about like this room, about a quarter, so like the first two rows of this slide maybe. Just that's how big a proportion of the country are facing these quite difficult financial circumstances. Could we go to the next slide, please? So one of the sort of silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic has been that it's highlighted quite a lot of the struggles that families in this country go through. So now I think quite a lot more people are aware of like the difficult financial circumstances that people are going through because a lot of people lost jobs. You sort of had to spend more money to like get by over the last year or so. Could we go to the next slide? And some of that is due to this man. Gavin Williamson mistakenly thought this was Maro Itoje a couple of weeks ago, but it's actually Marcus Rashford. So he campaigned quite heavily last year for the extension of the free school meals during the summer and then beyond that as well. So again, he's done quite a lot to sort of highlight some of the difficult situations that people are in. Could we go to the next slide? And also, when the pandemic started, the government announced this £20 uplift to universal credit. So there was actually this recognition from the government that the benefit system wasn't really giving adequate amounts to people. So actually they need this extra £20 a week to sort of get by and get through this difficult crisis. But in the next few days, it's going to be reduced by £20. And the government have sort of had a strange response to it in that they've announced these small grants for families that are going through difficult financial circumstances. which again is quite odd because they're sort of recognising that the £20 cut is a bad thing that they're doing, and they've sort of announced this £500 million package to try and address it, but because they know it's going to cause issues for a lot of families, but they still want to go ahead with the cut. So, could we go to the next slide? And the pandemic has also been quite different experience for families based on your initial financial position. So you had like general middle class families who were quite comfortably financially already. They were able to work from home and save money on like your commute, on your lunch, on like sort of after work activities. But people on lower incomes would have lost a lot of money. If we think back to the furlough scheme, so it was 80% of wages that the government was providing. So if you're already on minimum wage and your income, you're using 100% of your income on your expenditure, and suddenly you are now getting 80% of your income, where are you going to find that extra 20% from? So again, just putting people in very difficult financial circumstances. Could we go to the next slide? So a lot of you might be thinking, we've got a welfare system in this country, so we shouldn't really have poverty. So why is it that we do have sort of this situation? But there's quite a lot of issues with universal credit and the general benefit system. If we go to the next slide. So the main issue with the benefit system is actually just the amounts that people receive from the state for their living costs. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation have got this study called the Minimum Income Standard. So they sit down with a group of families and, or they do like a big research study about what's actually the minimum income that you need in this country to sort of have a dignified existence. If we go to the next slide. So these are the calculations that they've done for a single adult. So the bar on the left is if someone is just receiving benefits. The one in the middle is if they're working part-time on the minimum wage, and the final bar is if they're working full-time on the minimum wage. And actually that line above it is what this study has said is the minimum income. So as you can see, even if you're working full-time on minimum wage, you're not really earning a decent standard of living. But actually the benefits, it's like, yeah, less than half of what you probably need to have a decent income. If we go to the next slide. So again, this is the same calculation for a single parent with 2 children. On the benefits, it's not really going to be able to give you a decent standard of living. Working part-time, it's again not really that great either. The reason why full-time I think is only slightly more is because of the increased childcare cost. If we go to the next slide. And this is for a couple with 2 children. So again, only if they're both working full-time on a minimum wage will they be able to afford a decent standard of living in this country. If we go to the next slide, please. So there's also a question about what the welfare system should be and who it should be providing for. At the moment, we have quite a lot of people who are working in this country and who are living in poverty. But actually, that's more of a wages issue. Like we need to increase the wages so that they are out of poverty. What we should actually be thinking about the welfare state as getting funds to people that can't work. So under capitalism, if you can work, you get your income from your labour, so you can afford your lifestyle. But actually, if you can't work, then you need to get an income from somewhere. So these are sort of 7 groups of people who are like non-workers, who the welfare state should be revolving around. And within each of those groups, you sort of have your own different programs. So you should have like child benefit, a pension program, disability payments, so different things like that. So this is sort of like in an ideal scenario, if we have a good welfare state, who it should be helping. If we go to the next slide. But even still, there's sort of a lot of stigma around benefits and the welfare system, and we demonize the poor a lot in this country. It's like benefits, the welfare system is sort of seen as like a dirty word. Like even if you're going through a tough time, it's a bit embarrassing to tell someone that you're on benefits or you're applying for benefits. So we need to do a lot to challenge the stigma around that. If we go to the next slide. And because with poor families, we generally have this like moral magnifying glass where anything they do, we sort of deeply examine and like have to criticize and things like that. So a couple of years ago, it used to be that you get those programs on Channel 5 where they're saying, oh, these poor people on benefits, they've got all these flat screen TVs and smartphones. But actually, you can't really buy a non-flat screen TV anymore. And you need a smartphone to get through day to day, even if you're like to apply for benefits, you have to go through the online system. So you need a smartphone if you're not going to have a laptop or a computer at home. If we go to the next slide, please. We generally forget that life is very complex and people make irrational choices all of the time. If you haven't seen The Good Place, cover your ears because there's going to be some spoilers. It's a show about that's set in the afterlife. But what they find is that no one's been to heaven for about 521 years. Because there's a point system that rewards good deeds and punishes bad deeds, and because the world is so interconnected and because of unintended consequences, anything someone does is considered a bad deed. In fact, like when we examine our own lives, there may be things that we're doing that show that we're not really perfect either. If we go to the next slide. It's a bit of a ridiculous example, but the Daily Express ran that story about Meghan Markle's avocados linked to human rights abuse. But it shows like how you can connect anything to sort of unintended consequences. I don't think this is one of Miqdad's favourite newspapers, is it? Could we go to the next slide, please? So I just want to do a little experiment with the crowd here. So would you drive a particular type of car that you were 11% more likely to die in a crash inside that car compared to other cars? It was twice as likely to roll over in a crash compared to other cars. If it hit a pedestrian in an accident, that pedestrian was twice as likely to be killed than if they were hit by another type of car. And you were 27% more likely to be at fault in the event of an accident than another type of car. So please put your hand up if you would not drive a car that matches this description. Could you go to the next slide? So keep your hand up if you drive a 4x4. If you go to the next slide. So yeah, those are all the dangers of driving a 4x4. So again, we sort of make these rational choices that if you sort of deeply examine them, they're not really the best choices we can make. If we go to the next slide. If you want to get rid of your 4x4 now, you can donate your car through Give a Car and the funds will come to Al-Mizan. So please visit www.giveacar.co.uk for more information. If we go to the next slide, please. So another experiment. So would you shop at a retailer if you knew that they were timing the toilet breaks of employees, or forcing them to do compulsory overtime, banning holidays during the festive season, leaving water dispensers empty, and they had screens in front of employees that telling them exactly how many parcels they were packing over the last hour? So again, put your hand up if you wouldn't shop at a retailer that matched this description. If we go to the next slide, please. So who's... Next slide, please. So again, those are all things that Amazon do to their employees. So yeah, one of the things that we have to think about with poverty is about framing the conversation. And we have to consider our language very carefully. So we can't just say directly to people that you are in poverty, like we want to help people in poverty, this is what we're going to do. If we go to the next slide. So this is a quote from a 2014 report by Oxfam Child Poverty Action Group, the Church of England and the Trussell Trust into the use of food banks. So as you can see, people don't like describing themselves as being in poverty. When they're asking for help, they feel like it's an unnatural thing, it's embarrassing, and it's quite shameful for them to do. But if we are going to be serious about solving poverty in this in this country, we have to build support across society. And that includes things like changing our language and framing the conversation to challenge deeply held beliefs and divisive political and cultural narratives. If we go to the next slide, please. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have done quite a lot of research in this area about framing, and they've produced these 5 doodles to describe poverty in the UK. So the first one is about how poverty works. So poverty works like a current. So you might have difficult circumstances that sort of drag you under the current. But if you have a good social safety net, like a proper benefit system, it can give you a boat and sort of get you through those difficult times and be able to navigate your way through. Next slide, please. So another idea about people being locked in poverty. So this is about when there's circumstances beyond your control that are affecting you and affecting your well-being and affecting your sort of ability to like live a dignified existence. You're sort of locked in there, you can't really get out. Next slide, please. So loosening poverty's grip, so talking about how benefits can help unlock poverty's constraints. So yeah, just thinking back to the previous one about being locked in. If you're able to have decent benefits and adequate benefits, you can be able to get out of that difficult situation. Next slide, please. And thinking about how benefits are part of the solution. So we all rely on public services. The police probably isn't the best one to put up there after this week's events. But we all rely on state education, libraries, buses, the NHS, the railways. And benefits are like a part of that. Like it's not unnatural to sort of rely on public services and be part of society and contribute and take what you need as well. If we go to the next slide. And also thinking about how the economy can be redesigned. So a lot of poverty is down to low wages and exploitation of workers. But we've designed this economic system as human beings, and we can redesign it in a different way. We just sort of have to be able to escape the current ways of thinking. If we go to the next slide, please. So when we are considering solutions around poverty in the UK and how can we can actually prevent people going through these difficult financial circumstances, one of the things we have to remember is that charity and the charity sector is a very arbitrary thing. So with Al-Mizan, if like the trustees or myself or the volunteers don't want to do the work, it doesn't happen. There's sort of a lack of universal standards across the charity sector and everything is done on a whim. But when something is run by the state properly, you have like proper standards and accountability. And in theory, we've got a democratic process. So if the majority of people aren't happy with the way things are run, then they can change it. So there is that sort of like social buy-in to it and social stake within it. If we go to the next slide, please. And within the charity sector, sometimes the processes and solutions and projects that we come up with aren't necessarily the best use of resources. So if we look at this example about food poverty, so in this country, there's a lot of people reliant on food banks who are going through food poverty, so families cannot afford food. So they literally just can't go to the supermarket. If we go to the next slide, please. So what food banks in the charity sector have done is create this quite complex system. So if you've got a family who can't afford food, they have to request support from the statutory services who then have to refer them to the food bank. Now the food bank is also reliant on the supermarkets, so either they'll get donations from the supermarkets or they'll have to make purchases from the supermarket to get the food they need. With the general public, again, they're reliant on donations and volunteering. And also the general public will have to purchase items from the supermarkets to be able to donate it to the food banks. And then with businesses, so businesses might make donations to food banks, but food banks also have to rely on businesses for their purchases. So they have to have a venue, they have to have shelving, which costs quite a lot for food banks. They have to have like heating and utilities and everything to sort of manage the food bank. If we go to the next slide, please. Whereas sort of a more simpler system, if we had proper state-run welfare services, is food vouchers. So if you have a family that can't afford food, they can request support from statutory services, and they'll get food vouchers, which they can then go to the supermarkets to use directly. And then those food vouchers are being funded by the taxes from the general public and the businesses. Could we go to the next slide, please? So that's not a criticism of food banks or charities. That previous model is based on the state actually providing proper welfare to people. So in the absence of that, communities still need to help people. But again, it's just sort of thinking about, well, where are resources best placed? If we go to the next slide. So again, this was a study in America. So with homelessness, a lot of the intervention is around like helping rough sleepers and getting them into like emergency hostels, or providing them with resources that they need to sort of get through the night. But actually, like, there's a new projects coming out which are called housing first policies, where actually the idea is that when you have a homeless person, you just get them into a house and then you deal with the solutions, you deal with the issues after. If we go to the next slide. So in Florida, they found that the state was spending about triple on actually policing homeless people than it would cost to get each homeless person a house and a caseworker. Another study found in LA that they saved about 20% by putting people in supportive housing rather than sort of relying on hospitals and other places. And this other one in Canada found that, yeah, there wasn't really a change in money spent based on doing the housing first policy or doing the current interventions. If we go to the next slide. But there's also a deeper issue about the sort of connection between the charity sector and politics. So the charity sector is inherently political, but it's considered quite an apolitical thing. The charity sector is all about highlighting where people have been marginalized and what support they need, where they've fallen through the cracks, where state provision isn't really adequate. But we sort of have to realize that the long-term fix can't happen without state intervention. We sort of need those universal standards, that proper accountability, that sort of democratic buy-in from people. But until then, we can just have to do what we can and rely on charities and communities to support people. Next slide, please. And that's the end. Thank you very much for your time.
We have time for questions from either side.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
What have you seen a change in demand over the past year with COVID at Al-Mizan, or is it less, more so, or about the same in terms of requests for grants and things like that?
It's probably about the same. I think, yeah, poverty has always been an issue.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, the demand for our support has generally been the same over the last couple of years. But I think over the last year, obviously, a lot of the main issue that people are facing is that they've lost jobs because of COVID, or they've just got increased costs because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's generally been
the furlough system stopped today as well, didn't it?
Yeah,
So
yeah, the furlough system's now stopped. So, yeah.
cool, thank you.
So 3 questions. One is, first one, how long has this Mizan charity been going on or formed? Number 2, what is its turnover? And number 3, how much is the percentage used for admin purpose?
So we were set up in 2010, so going for about 11 years. Our turnover, I think, in the last financial year is about 100,000. And in terms of admin, so with donations towards our grants, we don't use that towards admin costs. We use gift aid. So yeah, so it wouldn't be coming out of the donations.
Okay,
Yeah.
So how much of this, also, if your donation is £100,000, yeah?
Yeah.
The amount of gift aid you get will be about 20,000 or something like that.
Yeah, probably about 10 to 15.
That will be used for admin.
Yeah, that would be used for admin. Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. This, you're saying that about just under a quarter of our people are in absolute poverty, and we are the 5th richest country in the world. Isn't that a very serious indictment of our social makeup? And why is this, as far as from the newspaper cuttings you had put there, you see that it is a deliberately whipped up attempt to just ignore the problem or put those people saying that these are completely undeserving.
Yeah.
I suppose COVID has made a little bit of difference because a lot others or asking for help who were not undeserving. But unless the whole political climate changes, we won't be able to address this problem. I mean, individually we can do our own small bits and pieces, but systematically we won't be able to change it.
Yeah, I think so. The Joseph Ramsey Foundation, a couple of years ago, they did a widespread study about how we can actually solve poverty in the UK. And it was exactly that. We basically have to change everything and like start over from scratch to sort of make everything anti-poverty or like prevent poverty from happening. I think in the first part of your question, so there's two issues there. There's sort of inequality and poverty. I think they are linked, but at the same time, if we sort of raise up the bottom, then I think inequality will still be an issue, but it won't be as much of an issue as poverty. I think we sort of have to do as much as we can to raise the bottom up first.
So some of the Scandinavian countries are doing better than us.
Yeah.
Is it because they're paying more taxes, or?
Yeah, I believe so. So I think Norway are quite fortunate because they've got the sovereign wealth fund from the oil reserves. But I think, from what I've read, those countries are happy with higher tax rates to be able to fund proper public services, or like a proper welfare state. So that when you are going through difficult times, you can rely on the state, and sort of you aren't really like scrambling around to pay for your living costs.
Last one, if I can. So recently, I've seen more and more debate on universal basic income. Has it come into the charity sector thinking about this as well? Yeah,
so it's become quite a popular issue over the last couple of years. I haven't done that much research about it, but I think with universal basic income, sort of, there are a couple of questions that you have to think about. So is it going to replace the current benefit system? So is it going to be a case that you get rid of universal credit, you get rid of all of that, and everyone just gets a flat rate from the state to be able to sort of cover different expenses? But just thinking back to that slide about the non-workers, so those people generally sometimes will have higher costs. So if you're disabled, you've got higher costs than an able-bodied person. You might need to pay for a wheelchair and different aids and things like that. So with universal basic income, would that take that into account? Would you be able to get a higher amount, or would it actually be like, no, this is universal? It has to be a set amount for everyone. And also just like some people will talk about universal basic income and they'll say for the richer people it'll get taxed away, but for the lower income people they'll be able to keep the full amount. So I think it's an interesting concept, but I think you sort of have to figure out how it fits in with our current society.
Some people have framed it as universal basic services, so which might be a slightly better.
Yeah, so I think
service.
Yeah, so Professor Jonathan Ports, he came here a couple of years ago and gave a really good talk about universal basic services. So he's saying rather than universal basic income, if you have a state that can guarantee specific key public services, so it was like housing, food vouchers, I think internet, care. So that might be better because it's not sort of based on the market. My other issue with universal basic income is that if, like, tomorrow the state announces, okay, everyone's going to get £300 a month for the next, as your state funding, everyone's landlords are just going to put up the rent by £300 the next time they can. So then, with the universal basic services, you sort of take away the market issue, and you sort of have proper standards within. So, like, if you're getting food vouchers, it's going to be definitely going to be enough for you to buy like decent food. So I think that might be the more interesting one than the basic income.
Why doesn't the government just give the money to the poor person still, even though they don't do it these times?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. The government has lots of priorities. Often they don't really know what's going on the ground, and they make decisions not based on full knowledge. But that's maybe why we need to all get more involved in politics and try and create a better society and become more engaged with the system.
I wanted you to talk more about the inequality versus poverty, because I was a little bit surprised that you seem to separate that. And just to say, in Scandinavian countries like Sweden, the point of paying more taxes and also having caps on income, for example, if you're a politician, you can't earn whatever, there will be a cap, is exactly to work on inequality because it goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I think it's just about sort of, I think they are definitely linked. I think it's like, there's one, I think it's Richard Wilkinson, who's written a book called The Spirit Level that talks about inequality in society and how societies are a lot better if they are more equal. So I'm not saying we shouldn't tackle inequality, but I think you also have to look at them in two different ways. So again, with the framing stuff that Joseph Rowntree Foundation has done, I think one of the things they say is that it's people don't really like when you attack like rich people or like sort of like to say like, oh, they're greedy, they need to give more money to poor people and things like that. So I think it's just about trying to frame the conversation in two different ways. So yeah, I'm not an inequality expert, so I can't really speak too much about it.
Quick question from me. Can you talk a little bit about why, about relative versus absolute poverty and how they, and why some people prefer targeting one over the other, and why relative poverty seems to be talked a bit more. And secondly, potentially more importantly, do you have any info on the number of people on benefits and how they vote? And do they end up voting for parties who support that or not?
On the second question, I don't know. Yeah. I remember reading like a random news story that was like someone didn't want to vote for Jeremy Corbyn because he'd said that he wants to get rid of food banks and they were reliant on a food bank. Well, I don't know how true that story was. On the first question, relative versus absolute. So based on the government measures, they are linked. It's just the absolute takes into account inflation. But yeah, I don't think there's a huge difference between the two. Yeah.
Last question.
So Ali, during the last Labour government, they introduced a certain number of universal benefits, like child benefit, for example, wasn't income related or something like that. It didn't seem to work badly, actually. In fact, the present child benefit structure looks to be working much less properly than that one. So there's some study to be done. But the last one, the question I want to ask is this. So we as Muslims, right, we don't seem to feel that if 25% of our neighbors on average are in absolute poverty, do we not owe them some part of our charity, if not all, instead of sending it to all kinds of other places?
So on the first question around means testing, so I think in America they're bringing in a child tax credit, but there is again a debate around whether, I think some people are saying don't means test it because it adds such a massive administrative issue to it. So you actually have to get people's tax returns and find out if they're actually eligible for it, and it just creates a massive palaver for. It's a lot easier just to make something universal and say, okay, like you're a child, you get this benefit. You're an elderly person, you get this benefit. It just saves a lot of stuff. On the second question, yes, I think it's a debate around zakat, because zakat is obviously quite restricted to Muslim recipients. But I think with sadaqah, we can always, go to anyone in theory. And yeah, I think we sort of have to realize that our lives in this country are interconnected with everyone around us. So if we can give to the people around us, then it makes everyone better off. So yeah, I don't know if I can get into too much of a theological discussion around zakat and khums. Yeah. I think the National Zakat Foundation have done quite a lot to sort of challenge the zakat. Not all zakat has to go abroad; some can be spent here. So yeah.
Final question from the back.
Thank you very much, Ali. So, interesting point that you made, that we should look towards changing the way the economy works, and then you gave a few examples. So if I recall correctly, you gave the example of food banks. You said it'd be cheaper if we did state-based funding, and you also gave the example of homeless people, it'd be cheaper to house them.
Yeah.
But in each of these, you're trying to make it cheaper. So you're still thinking in the way of efficiency of economy. And the danger of this argument is that, well, it may be more efficient to do something that's far less beneficial for poverty. So how do we rethink this properly so that we actually make arguments that can be structured correctly and then not counted in favor of poverty?
So I think with the food bank example, if you give people food vouchers from the state, then you sort of, like, okay, you save money, but then it's also, like, so from the report about food banks that Oxfam did, people found it quite embarrassing and unnatural to go into a food bank for a food parcel. But actually, if you give them a food voucher, they can just go to a supermarket, right, like they usually would. So you have that more dignified existence there. And again, with homeless people, so if you get them into the house first, you're sort of giving them that shelter, that like immediate protection that they need, and then you deal with the issues after. So I think, yeah, the studies have found it cheaper, but then also just thinking back to how, like, why politicians have created the system that doesn't really work for us. A lot of them do speak to value for money and income and expenditure and things like that. So often you have to use those arguments in these solutions to sort of say, okay, this is a cheaper option, but it's also better in different ways as well. So, but no, I agree, like, sometimes an intervention might cost more than another intervention, but it might be more beneficial to the person.
Last question.
Ali, that statistics that you mentioned, 44% of the population is there a gender divide on that? Would you be able to shed light on that? Of that 44%, how is it divided along gender lines?
So I think that statistic, it's 44% of the population have no savings at all. It's from an Aviva report. I can try and find it and send it to you. So I think, yeah, I don't know if it has a gender divide. Yeah. Yeah.
How much do you get government funding?
Zero.
Zero?
Yeah.
So what I mean to say, how do you manage to, obviously you guys got to get paid, you've got bills to pay, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So how do you manage to get yourself paid, and where does it come from?
So we rely on private donations, and then the gift aid from that is used for administrative costs. And yeah, like running events and things like that. We don't really have high admin costs because we're working remotely.
How many staff are you?
Zero, all volunteers.
All volunteers?
Yeah.
So what volunteer work would people do if they can put in 1 day, 2 day a week?
So mainly it's just around processing the grant applications from people. So people apply to us for financial support. So yeah, just about looking at the applications and thinking about how we can provide support for them.
And all the heating and in the building, that gets paid by the funds, yeah, you get?
Oh, we don't have an office, so it's all done remotely.
Ah.
Yeah.
All done by internet?
Yeah, everything's online.
So you work from home?
Yeah.
And all your other volunteers work from home, like they get application form?
Thank you very much, and thank you for answering all the questions, including the final ones. Just a quick notice before we finish. On Monday we have the Sheikh Jafar Ladik, who will be speaking to us on the death anniversary of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And next Friday we have Dr. Maria Norris, who will be speaking to us about reflections on 20 years of the war on terror. Inshallah, that will also be very interesting. Thank you very much. Ali, salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.